Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. So we've just heard, maybe it was a day ago on September 18th, that Laurie Vallow's motion to wear street clothing at trial has been approved, and that was a motion filed by Mark Means. And I must say, I've sort of been wondering whether Means has been taking instruction from John Pryor, Chad's lawyer, whether they are to some extent working together. Now, I can kind of imagine that happening, where it's sort of they pool the resources and they work together because, in a way, their clients are in it together, and they might almost pretend to be separate, but kind of behind closed doors, they might be sharing information and sharing ideas and strategies. I'm simply speculating that may be the case, that these defense attorneys might be putting their resources together, because certainly if the one defense attorney can successfully argue in a way that is going to acquit his client without blaming the other defendant. In other words, if the work of the one defense attorney can be such that it also helps the other defense attorney and his client, that they are not at cross purposes. And who knows, maybe they will both kind of throw Alex Cox under the bus. Maybe that is what they're going to try and do. Maybe if that's not succeeding, they may then sort of turn on each other. But I'm just saying that I wonder whether this idea to wear street clothing, whether it actually came from John Pryor. Of course, it may have come from Laurie herself, who is an ex-beauty queen contestant and a former hairdresser, and she does seem to be someone who is concerned about her appearance. We saw that from the jailhouse snitch, and we kind of get that impression a little bit from Laurie, who's had 5 husbands, and all 5 husbands, obviously something caught their eye, right? In this episode, I want to just touch briefly on high-profile defendants and just have a look very quickly at some of their approaches to appearing in court, and then I also want to share a little bit about my experience being in court with convicted murderers and seeing them literally in person, and having this weird reality shift where you're aware of the facts of the case, and here's this person sitting in front of you that doesn't seem like that at all. And I can almost compare that reality shift to something I've just heard on Sky News, where the reporters went to what they called the ground zero of the pandemic, when it was in Italy. And Italy was on severe lockdown, and yet when they flew out of that country and returned to their own country, they said it was like entering a new reality, a different reality. And there's something with that, just in how the appearance of a criminal appears in court. It's like an absolute reality shift. It's like, wow, what just happened there, right? So let's start with Laurie before we go into some of the other high-profile kind of candidates. Obviously, by looking at other men and women and their approach to their appearance in court, we can kind of get a sense from Laurie. So we can kind of ask ourselves, is Laurie going to appear as a brunette, Is she going to wear glasses? Is she going to appear kind of almost like a librarian, which is like the Jodi Arias approach? Or is she simply going to appear attractive? And we'll see why that is important. So there's quite a good article in Big Country News. I'll put a link to the article in the description. But we see that, she knows something about beauty, about presenting herself to an audience, because she's a former beauty pageant contestant. She's a hairstylist, and I think Laurie's interest in her appearance does extend beyond mere vanity. And when I say her interest, I kind of mean her lawyers as well. I'm sure her lawyer advised her to do this, or if it was Laurie's idea, I'm sure her lawyer or lawyers, if John Pryor is sort of working in the background, I'm sure that they were quite enthusiastic about it. Now, if you just kind of go into your short-term memory, do you remember when Harvey Weinstein appeared in court? He was sort of pushing a walker. Do you remember when Bill Cosby appeared in court? He sort of seemed to be blind. And that kind of thing is intended to make the jury feel sympathy, and so not want to. It's almost like the defendant is the victim kind of thing. And so why would you want to hurt the victim who's already suffering? That's kind of the psychology. According to this article in Big Country News, there's some great references to studies that have shown defendants wearing prison attire are convicted at a statistically higher rate than those wearing civilian clothing. And one example is Patrick Frazee. He appeared in court in kind of like a light green and dark green prison outfit, whatever you want to call it, kind of with horizontal lines on it, and he got the sort of full sentence. He got a really heavy sentence. He was successfully convicted for his crime. Another who was memorably sentenced to life without parole while sporting an orange jumpsuit, and I think he also arrived at trial on at least one occasion wearing a bulletproof vest, was Chris Watts. But a lot of thought, and so these guys are the exceptions, but a lot of thought went into choreographing the look and feel of defendants, including Casey Anthony, Oscar Pistorius, Amanda Knox, Jodi Arias, and O.J. Simpson. I think you can add quite a few others to that, like Scott Peterson. But of that short list, Casey Anthony, Oscar Pistorius, Amanda Knox, Jodi Arias, and O.J. Simpson, 3 of those defendants beat the charges against them, and a 4th, Oscar Pistorius, came perilously close. So the question is, how will Laurie fare? How will she do, given that juries tend to kind of let people off when they look quite attractive, right? Now, I want to sort of highlight 2 or 3 examples of cases where there was definite choreography. So with Amanda Knox, this is really interesting. I don't know how many people are aware of this, but with Amanda Knox, during her first, how can I put it, her first trial appearance, when I mean that, I don't mean like just one day, I mean the first, when she sort of stood trial, charged with the murder of Meredith Kercher for the first time. I call that the first trial. She kind of seemed to be, the intention seemed to be selling the idea that she was a goofball, that she was just a odd person, and because of her strange personality, she did strange things. In other words, you could explain away all the strange behavior by saying, well, she's an oddball, she's goofy, right? And I'm not going to go into all those things, but her dress code tended to support that. And if you didn't think that that was intentional, if you think, well, she just put on whatever she could, no one really thought about it, well, you get a real sense that that wasn't the case when you see what she wore during what I call the second trial, which is the appeal for the murder conviction. And the strategy there was to present Knox as a very well-behaved, almost Italian young woman. So if you could kind of imagine the perfect Italian student, someone who was modest, someone who was sort of reserved, someone who was well-behaved, someone who was polite and intelligent and a good student. Well, that was how she was dressed. She had a haircut, her hair was cut relatively short, and she was dressed far more modestly and in a way smartly. So she sort of dressed in kind of tasteful blouses that made her seem like a well-brought-up young woman. And guess what happened? She won her appeal. She was found not guilty in what I call the second trial, which is basically the appeal. And there you can see how much effort went into the one strategy, and it didn't work, so they tried another strategy. So that's Amanda Knox. With Casey Anthony, I'm sure a lot of you are aware that she also was dressed in court in a way that you wouldn't really have expected her to dress before in her life. She was someone who had a tattoo on her shoulder and liked going to nightclubs, but the way she appeared in court didn't represent that at all. Jodi Arias went from being blonde to looking like a bookish librarian, from like a sex machine to a kind of, she looked almost like an abused librarian kind of thing. Now, what I want to talk to you a little bit about in detail is my personal experience being in court, firstly with Oscar Pistorius and secondly with Henry van Breda, who was a triple axe murderer. So if you think the Chris Watts case is bad, where, you know, he murdered his family, with Henry van Breda, he axed his family to death, both his parents, his older brother, and then he also tried to axe his sister to death. She somehow survived. So there were 3 victims who were, you know, it's not just one blow with the axe, it's multiple blows, and the paramedic described a waterfall of blood. Anyway, I will get to that in a second. So with the Oscar Pistorius case, what was really weird was, and again, you had this sense of conflicting realities. I sat in court, and you kind of had this idea of that Oscar, if you said a word loudly, that he would start crying. If you dropped a book on the floor, that would make like a bang, he would have like PTSD. You know, that he was like just hanging on by a thread kind of thing. And you just kind of got the sense that he was barely holding it together. And that was quite an interesting performance, especially when you juxtaposed it to the Oscar Pistorius in an Olympic stadium who could deal with huge amounts of pressure, who was used to guns going off all the time. In fact, he was trained to respond to that kind of sound, and you know, he's also someone who would go hunting, and now suddenly I wouldn't say the sight of blood, but even just somebody mentioning the word blood, and he would just get sick. And so you had this guy who has transformed from this triumphant, hyper-masculine champion to this absolute pathetic, quivering wreck kind of thing. And I was actually in court when he did like a walk across of the court where he wasn't wearing his stumps, and you sort of got the sense that if you just touched him on the shoulder, he might fall over. That is how difficult it was for him to balance, or how rickety his whole stature was, if I can put it that way. And yet again, this was a guy who was, when he was campaigning to compete against able-bodied competitors, was saying how he's just like everybody else, and he's not afraid of anything, and he doesn't have any disabilities. Of course, when he was on trial for murder, it was the opposite. He was half a person and totally different to everyone else, and afraid of everything and all that kind of thing. And like Letitia Stork, he had to go for kind of a mental evaluation because he was sort of claiming that he was just very overcome with fear and all sorts of other things. And anyway, they found him fit to stand trial. So the other person that I want to talk about is Henry van Breda, and it's not a very well-known case. It should be. I sat in on that case, and I actually had a close encounter with the accused. That's what we call them in South Africa. It's actually the defendant in America. That's the parlance. But he actually brushed by me intentionally, kind of bumped into me as he passed me, and said something to me. I'm not going to say what it was. I won't say it here. But the funny thing with Henry van Breda is, like, people who read my books, it's the first book is Indefensible, Van Breda, and then the others are Diablo 2, 3, 4, whatever. But there were a couple of readers who contacted me while the trial was underway and just saying, there's no way this guy could have done that. You know, he's such a good-looking, well-brought-up, nice, soft-spoken, intelligent, mild-mannered young man. You know, he seemed shy. He just seemed almost like a sweet guy. And through that, I could certainly tell that act was working with a lot of people. People just, based on his appearance, thought this guy could never have done that. And it was quite convincing in the sense that he seemed very well brought up. He seemed like a nice person. He seemed smart. He would come to court wearing a suit, just like Oscar. And, he would often wear a different tie, and the media would talk about his ties. One of his ties even had a Van Gogh, just like Starry Night on his tie, and so on and so on. And I eventually sort of said to these people who just insisted that there's no way he could have done it, not based on evidence, not based on his testimony, not based on anything, just based on his appearance, just said, looking at this guy, I just can't see I could have done something like this. And I said to them, do you think that he was wearing a suit when he did this? Do you think he was wearing a suit and tie when he committed this crime? And I said, one of the reasons there's this mismatch, this kind of programming glitch, is you always see the guy neat and polished and in a suit, but that's not how he appeared in a crime scene. And what you really want to go and do when you're caught up in these impressions, go and look at the crime scene photos, and there are photos taken of Oscar covered in blood, and he's got a kind of a look on his face. There are pictures of Henry van Breda looking dazed and confused, not even wearing a shirt, never mind not wearing a suit. He's sort of kind of in his underwear, also to some extent covered in blood. That's actually how they appeared. And if you wanted to be be strictly according to the kind of authentic reality of the case itself, you should really be trying the guy in the clothing he was found at the scene, which, as I say, is Oscar with his stumps badly damaged and blood all over himself. And interestingly enough, Oscar, when photos were taken of him, he had actually already washed his chest and his hands. So as bloodied as he is, he'd actually washed up anyway. Same with Henry van Breda. So you've really got to imagine them in the crime scene looking like that. Now, it's a little bit different with Laurie Vallow because we don't really have a situation like that. She was arrested in Kauai, totally different environment. And I don't know if you've seen that video where she's arrested. It is quite bizarre. It's like, what's happening here? It feels very different to Chris Watts, who's been wearing the same clothes since his sermon on the porch. And, he wore those clothes also in the interrogation, which went on for hours. Not only the interrogation on Tuesday night, but throughout Wednesday and the lie detector test. And then when he was arrested and taken to jail, he was still wearing those same clothes. So I guess the point of this episode is just to say that appearances are very, very important when it comes to court cases. It can mean the difference between several years of a particular sentence. It can really, you can also have one particular juror maybe falling in love with somebody or just sympathizing with them, which you sort of had happen with Jodi Arias. You had one juror kind of holding out, and that's all it takes. It just takes one juror to just feel, wow, I really can't see that this is the case. I think you even had something like that with Robert Durst, where someone thought, I can't imagine a small old guy like that cutting up a body. I just can't imagine it. And what's the problem there? Is it the ability or the culpability or the evidence of this defendant, or is it a failure of the imagination from the jury or from the juror? Already we're seeing quite a big difference between Chad's appearance so far. He looks quite well groomed and sort of polished. He sort of looks shaved and clean and crisp. He often is wearing like a white shirt with a collar, and him and his lawyer almost look like they could be friends. They just sort of it looks sort of well put together. Now, if you compare that to Laurie, who looks disheveled, she looks like she is needing a little bit of sleep, but she's also not wearing, that kind of clothing, civilian clothing. And so you get a totally different look and feel. And so obviously, can you imagine if Laurie was tried with Chad, but she's in kind of prison garb the whole time and he's not? Just that alone is going to kind of just make the jury think, okay, it's her. Do you know what I mean? By the same token, if they're both in prison garb, you're going to get a sense that they are in it together. Or if she's in civilian clothing and he's not. I'm just saying these appearances have a much stronger impact on our decision making than you might think. And intelligence isn't based necessarily on memory and facts and evidence. It's based to some extent on what appears to be to us self-evident when it may not necessarily be. Okay, and that is it. For those following the Watts case, I will be analyzing the Netflix documentary American Murder, The Family Next Door. That's coming out on September 30th, so that is something I'm doing on the channel. I'm also doing a series every Friday, Understanding Laurie Vallow, just trying to understand how cults work, and that is something I do every Friday on Patreon. So if you're interested, head on over there. It's Patreon/TCRS. But I will be continuing to provide coverage of the Laurie Vallow case on this channel. If you're interested in this case and other high-profile cases, please subscribe to the channel, like, share, leave a comment, and I'll see you guys next time.